Wales looks quiet. Green hills, stone chapels, old terraced streets climbing into valleys that most people drive through without stopping. But 17 of those villages are carrying something that does not show on the surface. We are counting 17 weirdest villages in Wales you should never visit alone. And you will want to stay to the end because number 1 is a story the British government would probably prefer you not think about too hard. And unlike every other entry on this list, it is not finished. Tylorstown sits in the Rhondda Valley, terraced streets climbing the hillside above where the colliery used to be. It looks like dozens of other former mining villages in South Wales, which is almost the point. On the 28th of January 1896, a gas explosion underground killed a significant number of men, one more disaster in a valley that had already seen too many and would see more. The Rhondda had more coal than almost anywhere in the South Wales coalfield, which meant it also had more pits, more men going underground every morning, and more events like this one written into the local papers, and then quietly absorbed by the landscape. What makes Tylorstown register on a list like this isn't a dramatic ruin or a famous memorial. It's the gap between how the village looks now and what it absorbed. Quiet streets, a few shut chapels, hillsides that have gone green over the old spoil. You could walk through without realizing what the place had swallowed. A few miles further up the Rhondda, Wattstown sits near Porth. On July 11th, 1905, an underground explosion at the Wattstown National Colliery killed 120 men. A single morning that removed more than 100 workers from a community that depended entirely on that colliery for its income. There were no state pensions for coal widows in 1905, no meaningful welfare provision, nothing that softened what came after for the women and children left behind. The pit is closed now, the spoil heaps have been grassed over, and the shafts are sealed. It looks almost normal from the street, and that is what makes it strange. The scale of what happened here, and the quiet surface of the place today, do not match, and they never will. Cwmaman sits in a side valley near Aberfan, and the name translates as Aman Valley after the small river running through it. The village grew entirely because of coal. The terraces were built to house the miners, the chapels to serve their faith, and the working men's institutes to give them somewhere to spend their evenings away from the pit. No single catastrophic event defines Cwmaman. It just slowly stopped being what it was built to be. The economics of coal collapsed, and the industry that had called this village into existence packed up and left. What you're looking at now is a community that hasn't gone anywhere, but has lost the reason it was built. Disused chapels, shut clubs, streets designed for a workforce that dispersed over decades. Not a ghost town exactly. Something slightly harder to name. Maerdy sits at the very top of the Rhondda Valley, the smaller of the two Rhondda valleys. For most of the 20th century, it carried the nickname Little Moscow because it was one of the most politically radical communities in the British coalfield. The miners here were not just workers underground. They were union members, socialists, people whose politics stretched well beyond the valley walls, and the BBC documented how, after the colliery closed and unemployment arrived and families drifted out, the community's sense of itself as something specific and defiant stayed anyway. The physical evidence of what it was is still there, the terraces, the chapels, the remnants of the institute culture. But the economic system that made all of it possible has gone. And what is left is a village that knows exactly what it is, even though the world that formed it no longer exists. Six Bells is a small community near Abertillery in Blaenavon. On the 28th of June 1960, an explosion at Six Bells Colliery killed 45 miners, another date in a long and heavy calendar. What sets Six Bells apart visually is the Guardian, a large sculpture on the former pit site. a human figure built from open metalwork standing above the ground where the men died. The steel construction is semi-transparent, which means in low light or mist it takes on something close to a spectral quality, a presence that's neither solid nor absent. The valley below has gone green again, and families walk past the sculpture on ordinary days. It's not a ruin, and it isn't a straightforward tourist attraction. It's a community that decided to mark what happened without pretending the landscape could be made neutral again. If you are finding these entries as unsettling as they should be, give this a thumbs up and keep going, because the next 9 include the places where the numbers become genuinely difficult to sit with. Ynysybwl is in Rhondda Cynon Taf, tucked into one of the smaller side valleys. The village grew around the Lady Windsor colliery, and the relationship between the two was total. The colliery called the village into existence, built its housing, employed its population, and when it closed, it left behind a community working out what it was now. Local heritage projects have documented the oral history, the photographs, and the social texture that made Ynysybwl distinct for 100 years. From the pubs and choirs to the working men's clubs and the particular density of a place built to be complete in itself. Walking through it today, you can still read the bones of that complete industrial society. The rows of housing, the chapels, the layout of streets designed to move a workforce from home to pit and back again. The structure is visible. The purpose it served has gone. Blaenavon is in Torfaen, just east of the main valley's communities, and in 2000 the area around it became a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Blaenavon industrial landscape was recognised as outstanding evidence of South Wales's role as a dominant iron and coal producer in the 19th century. What that means on the ground: blast furnaces, workers' cottages, spoil tips, tram roads and mine shafts, all still present and largely intact, embedded in a landscape where people still live. Big Pit National Coal Museum takes visitors underground into an actual former working mine, and above-ground everyday life carries on between the ruins. That's what makes Blaenavon strange in a way a fully abandoned site wouldn't be. People are buying groceries and walking dogs in a landscape that UNESCO has formally designated a monument of global industrial significance. The heritage, interpretation, and the ordinary daily life occupy exactly the same space, and neither seems to notice the other. Abercarn is in the Abbey Valley in Monmouthshire. In 1878, an explosion at the Prince of Wales colliery killed 268 men and boys, making it the worst mining disaster recorded in the United Kingdom at the time. The explosion flooded the colliery, and many of the bodies were never recovered. They are still down there, sealed into the shaft that was closed above them, and the village sits on top of an unmarked mass grave. That is not a metaphor. The physical reality is that the streets of Abercarn are built above a flooded underground space where more than 200 people died in 1878 and were left there. The village looks like a village. The ground underneath it does not match what the surface suggests. Northwest Wales is a different country from the valleys in terms of culture, language, and the kind of industrial history it carries. This area produced the slate that roofed most of Victorian Britain, and the industry left behind something you do not see in the coal country: quarries so large they changed the permanent shape of the mountains. The villages around quarries like Penrhyn and Dinorwich were built entirely for the quarry workforce, with rows of identical stone terraces, chapels, schools, and narrow-gauge railways running slate down to the ports. In 2021, UNESCO recognised the slate landscape of Northwest Wales as a World Heritage Site, extending the same international designation that Blaenavon received, and for the same reason. What the communities around places like Abergynolwyn and Corris carry now is a very particular silence. The quarry infrastructure is still present: the inclines, the processing sheds, the waste tips. The holes in the mountains are permanent. The communities are a fraction of what they were, and the buildings that remain are outnumbered by the scale of what was built for a purpose that stopped existing decades ago. Mynydd Epynt is a broad upland plateau in Powys, and in June 1940, the Ministry of Defence gave orders to around 54 farming families living there. They had 6 weeks to leave. Their farms, their fields, their Welsh language chapel school, all of it was being absorbed into what would become the Senghenydd training area, a military zone used for live fire exercises. The families left because they had no meaningful choice. The land was sealed behind a military fence and has stayed sealed ever since. Those farmsteads are still there, inside the restricted zone, and you can see them from the perimeter road. Stone walls still standing in some places, fields grown over, buildings returning to the ground slowly the way buildings do when no one tends them. The military has been training on that plateau for more than 80 years. The families who were removed have never been allowed back, and their descendants carry a phrase that still appears on walls and t-shirts in Wales. Mynydd Epynt. Remember Epynt. Stay with this one because number 7 is inside the same fence, and it makes number 8 stranger in retrospect. Inside the same military training area, the Ministry of Defence built a village. It is called a FIBUA site, which stands for Fighting in Built-Up Areas. The purpose was to give soldiers realistic urban environments to train in, streets, buildings, the kind of layout a military unit might encounter in a real town. They planted woodland in geometric squares to simulate forest cover, and built structures that look, from certain angles, like an ordinary village. Nobody has ever lived there. The buildings were designed as targets and training props, not as homes. And there are no residents, no history, no community inside the fence, just the visual vocabulary of a village with none of the substance. Urban explorers who have documented the area describe it as somewhere between a film set and a ghost town. The uncanny quality comes from the combination of recognizable forms, streets and walls and doorways, alongside the total absence of the human accumulation that normally fills those forms. It looks like a place. It is not one. And the same military zone holds both things: the decaying farms of real Welsh families removed in 1940, and a fake village built as a training target. Both are inside the same fence a few miles apart. Senghenydd is a village near Caerphilly, in the Rhymney Valley. On the 14th of October 1913, an explosion tore through the Universal Colliery and killed 439 men and boys, making it the deadliest mining accident ever recorded in the United Kingdom, a record that still has not been broken. It was not even the first disaster at the same mine. An explosion at Universal Colliery in 1901 had already proved how dangerous it was, but the 1913 inquiry found that the management had not made the ventilation changes required under the Coal Mines Act 1911, changes that might have allowed the fans to reverse airflow in an emergency and push smoke and toxic gases out through the shaft instead of further into the workings. The colliery owner was prosecuted and he was fined £24. 439 men died on a Tuesday morning, and the owner, whose company had ignored the safety requirements that might have kept them alive, paid £24. The village today has no visible ruins. The terraced streets, the chapels, and the hillsides look like every other part of this valley. The absence of visible evidence does not change the arithmetic. Corris sits in the DYFI Valley in Gwynedd on the southern edge of the Snowdonia Range. It was a slate quarrying community, and the quarry above the village still dominates the skyline, even though commercial extraction stopped decades ago. The village was built entirely around the trade. The chapel, the school, the narrow rows of terraced houses, and a narrow gauge railway carried slate down to the coast. At its peak, the community was sized for an industry that employed most of its working population. And when that industry left, the population thinned out behind it over many years. What remains is a village whose scale makes no sense for the number of people living there now. Streets built for hundreds are occupied by dozens. The chapel can hold more people than the village currently has. The quarry sits above the empty terraces with the indifference of something that outlasted everything built around it. In 2013, a residential hamlet was completed in Wales with houses, roads, and the standard appearance of a small residential development. As far as anyone can determine, no one has ever permanently lived there. It is not a military site and it is not labelled as anything unusual. A developer built it, it was completed, and it sits there looking like a place where people should be going about their daily lives. The eeriness here is modern rather than historical, and there is no disaster, no forced removal, no ancient ruin behind it. It is just a collection of homes that looks inhabited from the outside, and is not. A development that completed its physical construction without ever completing the thing a village is actually supposed to be. It connects to the FIBUA site at Senghenydd in a way that is not coincidental, so much as uncomfortable. These are two places in Wales with all the visual language of habitation, but none of the habitation itself, separated by 8 decades and by entirely different origins, arriving at the same result. Valle Crucis Abbey stands in the Dee Valley near Llangollen in Denbighshire, and it has been a ruin for 5 centuries. The Cistercian monastery was founded in 1201 and dissolved in the 16th century. The walls are still standing to a considerable height, with the founder's tomb still inside what remains of the chapter house. The settlement around the abbey is a small cluster of farms and houses that has grown around this ruin for 800 years. The valley is narrow and steep-sided, which gives it a quality of enclosure that feels different from the open coalfield valleys to the south. The ghost stories attached to Valle Crucis are folklore. The same as any ruined medieval abbey accumulates over 5 centuries. What is not folklore is the specific quality of a living settlement that has orbited a ruin for longer than most countries have existed in their current form. The abbey outlasted the institution that built it, the community it served, and several versions of the country it stood in. The village around it is still there. Aberfan is a village in the Taff Valley, a few miles south of Merthyr Tydfil. On the morning of 21st October 1966, the coal waste tip on the hillside above the village began to move. Tip 7 had been built over many years on permeable ground above natural springs. Villagers had raised concerns about the tip's stability before that morning, and those concerns had not resulted in action. Just after 7, the tip began to shift, and by 9:15, approximately 107,000 cubic meters of liquefied black coal slurry had broken free and roared down the hillside. It crossed a disused canal, burst through a water main, cleared an old railway embankment, and reached Pantglas Junior School at the bottom of the slope. In the space of a few minutes, 18 houses and the junior school were obliterated. 144 people died. 116 of them were children between the ages of 7 and 10 at school on a Friday morning in October. 109 of the dead were pupils at Pantglas Junior School, and 5 were teachers. The last surviving teacher later described being asked to identify the children's bodies before their families were told. The British Geological Survey's analysis of the disaster was unambiguous. This was not a natural event. The tip had been built on permeable ground above springs, whose presence had been reported. The instability was predictable and the warnings had been dismissed. The National Coal Board's negligence was not incidental to what happened. It was the mechanism. The memorial garden stands where the school was. The cemetery above the village holds many of the children's graves in uniform rows. Aberfan is still a living community. The residents did not leave. They are still there, and for them this is not heritage. It is what happened to their families. The Mynydd Epynt plateau in Powys sits above the Brecon Beacons, a wide upland of moorland and farmland that was, until the summer of 1940, home to a distinct Welsh-speaking farming community. 54 families farmed the plateau, and in some cases their families had been there for centuries. The farms were stone-built and working, connected by tracks across the moorland, with a Welsh-language chapel and school at the centre of daily life. This was Welsh-speaking Wales in an area and an era when the Welsh language was already under pressure elsewhere, and the community on Epynt was one of the last moorland farming communities where it was the first language people used every day. In June 1940, the Ministry of Defence ordered them to leave within 6 weeks. The plateau was needed for a military training ground. The families had no legal recourse that mattered. They packed what they could and left. The farms are still there, and the plateau is still sealed. You can reach the perimeter, and in some places you can see the stone walls of the farmsteads from the road, slowly returning to the earth without anyone maintaining them. The chapel is gone. The school is gone. The community that spoke Welsh on that plateau is gone. What is left is a phrase, Cofiwch Epynt. Remember Epynt. It shows up on walls, on protest signs, in discussions about Welsh land rights and language rights and what the British state has done and continues to do with Welsh territory. The eviction of the Epynt families did not end with the war. The Ministry of Defence simply kept the land, and 85 years later, they still have it. The farms are still inside the fence, and nobody who was removed has ever been allowed back. That is number one. Not a disaster, not a geological accident, not the failure of a safety regulation. A deliberate decision by a government to remove a Welsh-speaking community from its land, seal it behind a military fence, and decline to return it when the war that justified the decision ended. The Senghenydd training area is still operational. The farms on Mynydd Epynt are still in there. 54 families left in 1940, and the land has not come back. Drop a comment and let us know which of these 17 deserves its own full video. There are a lot more places like this in Wales, and we'll keep coming back to find them.